Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank Leo for this opportunity. I'm quite sorry that I'm unable to attend in person. My wife had a severe accident in Patagonia last Monday. We spent most of the time getting back to Boston, and she had emergency surgery on Sunday morning to stabilize her spine. I really can't be away from home at this time. Image number 1 is my conflicts of interest slide. In addition to being editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, I'm also one of the editors of Cecil's Medicine and Asman's COPD. And if any of you are interested in buying any one of these products, just let me know by email and I'll help you do that. If I can have image 2 now. Imagine you're not feeling so well, and so you go to see the doctor. You tell him about your complaints, and he does a physical examination and says, I'm not really sure what's wrong with you. Maybe you should come into my back room where I have a special machine that I can use to make a diagnosis, and then once I've made a diagnosis, I can use it again to determine treatment. And you say, sure, we should do that. And so you go into the back room, and if I could have image 3, here's his machine. And you say, I don't know. I don't want my medical care to be determined by the play of chance. But the facts are that for centuries, we've done just that. And today I'd like to talk about how we went from going to the play of chance to understanding exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. Image 4, please. Medicine's taught by example. So imagine about 300 kilometers, the distance between Boston and New York. The best way is to go by stagecoach. It takes about 6 days, and just your luck, you're cooped up in this small box with a man who coughs the entire time. Well, you finally make it to Boston, image 5, but you don't ever really feel very well. And so after about 6 months, you go to see the doctor. And in this painting by Anne-Louise Giraud de Roussy-Triosson, painted about that time, you have a guy that could be this patient. He tells about the stagecoach ride. He says that he's developed cough with some sputum production, that he has coughing up blood, that he has sweats at night, and has been losing weight. Now at that time, next image please, all the physician could do was to look to see that there was loss of muscle mass. But the doctor's fairly with the picture, and he makes a diagnosis. Next image, please. What is the diagnosis? You all should know. It's tuberculosis, called back in 1800s pulmonary consumption, or phthisis. But the doctor's just playing the odds. Image number 8, please. This is an abstract of the bill of mortality for the town of Boston in the year 1810 through 1811. There were 942 deaths, as shown in the bottom right-hand corner. Next, number 9, you can see that the most common cause of death was tuberculosis, consumption. So you make that diagnosis in your patient, it fits exactly with his symptoms, and you go on to treatment. Image number 10, please. Well, at that time, the treatments for tuberculosis were the use of preparations of gold. These are all from the New England Journal of Medicine. Image 11, please, or silver. Image 12, please, or spending time at the seaside. And here we see a bathing infirmary in Ostend, and it's a letter about a physician who claims that he had a patient who was cured by going to Flanders for the bathing. Image 13, please. Now, in the next 100 years, and we're going to talk about that, new medical knowledge mitigates the play of chance in diagnosis. But with respect to treatment, we still are doing things with respect to play of chance. So what is the new knowledge? Image 14. It started with Semmelweiss, a Hungarian obstetrician who practiced at the Poor Woman's Hospital in Pest. But at his hospital, his patients did much better than the patients at the rich woman's hospital. And the reason for this was that he asked all his doctors to wash their hands before they did any perinatal manipulations of the mother. He prevented childbed fever because of this. But he was laughed out of town. In fact, he died in an insane asylum because nobody understood why washing a doctor's hands would be beneficial. It took, image number 15 please, Pasteur, who in the 1860s elucidated the germ theory of disease. This had escaped Semmelweiss. But Pasteur was able to show that disease, especially childbed fever and similar things, were caused by germs that had not been identified at that time, and that germs were identifiable and transmissible. And with elucidation of the germ theory of disease, we had an understanding for how hygiene could have a benefit. Pasteur had nothing to do with tuberculosis. Image number 16, please. That took this man, Jean-Antoine Villemin, who showed in 1861 that tuberculosis was contagious. And the way he did this was he had a patient who died from tuberculosis, and he removed the caseous material from a pulmonary lesion and exposed a rabbit to it, and the rabbit developed tuberculosis. And so he showed that the tuberculosis lesions were contagious. And he said, La tuberculose est contagieuse, donc évitable. It's contagious and therefore preventable. In fact, this stamp was part of an anti-tuberculosis series that was used to raise money for tuberculosis outreach in France. In fact, this is, you will see, a very important part of the public health response to tuberculosis. Image number 17, please. It was this man, Robert Koch, who identified the tubercle bacillus as the cause of tuberculosis. And the original demonstration occurred in March of 1882. Image 18 shows Koch's drawings of the tuberculosis bacillus, and image number 19 shows a modern scanning EM of the tuberculosis bacillus. And you can see that Koch's renderings were extraordinarily accurate. In fact, he developed postulates to demonstrate causality between the presence of a microbe and the presence of a disease.
Slide 20.
Koch received the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology 23 years after this discovery, 1905. But it turned out that his discovery was not enough for clinical use. It took two of Koch's students,
Slide 21.
Gilles and Nielsen, who realized that the methods that Koch used to identify the tubercle bacillus in clinical specimens was really inadequate for routine clinical use. And they developed the acid-fast stain, the so-called Ziehl-Nielsen stain, which today, over 120 years later, represents the gold standard for the identification of tuberculosis. And as you can see from image 22, they're easy to identify in a stained sputum specimen when there are lots of them. The problem is that in mild cases of tuberculosis, they may be very hard to find. And so it's highly specific, but not terribly sensitive. But it represents the current gold standard. So we had a way of knowing who had tuberculosis if they could cough up sputum. But we needed better diagnostics. We needed to know who had tuberculosis before they got really sick. And that took the help of another man. This is Röntgen, who in 1895 discovered X-rays, as shown in image 23. Now, image 24 shows his tools. On the left, we see a Crookes tube. The cathode is hooked to the far left, the anode is on the bottom, and the rays would emanate from this tube and out the barrel of what looks like a gun. He was working in his laboratory, and when he interposed his hand between the ray source, that is the Crookes tube, and a phosphorescent screen, he could see his bones. He realized how important this was, and so he asked his boss for a year off to study it. Now, he worked in the lab with his wife, and he asked her to hold her hand still while he took a photograph of the phosphorescent screen showing the image of her hand. And that first X-ray ever taken was published in December of 1895. That mass on her finger is her wedding ring. And as you can see in image 25, he received the Nobel Prize in Physics 6 years after his discovery. Remember, it took Koch 23 years before he received his Nobel Prize. Image 26, please. So from this new knowledge, diagnosis became certain, and therefore tuberculosis, which was the biggest medical disease of the time, became the focus of a massive public health effort to mitigate the problems of tuberculosis. Image 27, please. And they were successful public health efforts, as can be seen from this graph that shows from 1840 to 1960 the deaths from tuberculosis in England and Wales. We didn't have treatment for tuberculosis until 1948, and so everything that you see here represents public health. But with the knowledge contributed by Semmelweiss and then Pasteur and Villemin and Koch and Zeal and Nilsson and Röntgen, they had a strategy. And the strategy was simple. Find people with tuberculosis and get them out of town. Put them someplace where they would not contaminate the rest of the population. The tuberculosis sanitarium. And so there were two components to this. We had to find people with TB, and we had to have a place to put them. Image 28 shows the cross of Lorraine. This was adopted in the late 1800s as the sign of the anti-tuberculosis movement. It was the same cross that was used by crusaders during trips to the Holy Land. The only real difference is that the pointed ends were to represent what the tubercle bacillus looked like under the microscope. You'd have to have a pretty thick infestation to have this bad an infection, but this became, and it still remains, the international sign for tuberculosis. Image 29, please. So to raise money for this, it started in Denmark, the idea of selling stamps for anti-tuberculosis treatment. And it was first started in 1904, and the stamps were put on correspondence, not necessarily to mail them. In some cases, yes, in some countries, no, but as a sign that you supported the anti-tuberculosis movement.
Slide 30.
This was the first. It was quickly adopted in the U.S. Here you see a postcard with a 1-cent stamp on the right, representing the U.S. postage, but a Christmas seal, as it was called, on the left, money that was raised from these stamps used to fund tuberculosis outreach events.
Slide 31.
We see a stamp from 1914.
Slide 32.
And from 1949. In fact, all throughout the world, many people use the idea of raising money for tuberculosis through stamps. So where did the money go? Well, the idea was to identify patients and put them in a sanitarium. Image 33, please. Here we see two sanitaria, one in Davos and one in Hungary. And these were out in the country, large places, sometimes big, sometimes small, where patients with tuberculosis could go. They generally were run by a physician and group of physicians who were interested in the treatment of patients with tuberculosis, not that the treatments were very effective at that time. This is a tuberculosis sanitarium shown in image 34 in the northern part of China. Here you can see the cross of Lorraine on either side of the gates, and over it it says, so I'm told, the tuberculosis sanitarium. I've been looking for an image of a tuberculosis sanitarium from Italy for this talk, but I was unable to find one. So if someone has a turn of the century from 1890 to 1910, 1920, an image of an Italian tuberculosis sanitarium, I'd love to have it. If you could please send it to me. Image 35 shows a sanitarium in Saskatchewan. Image 36 shows one in El Paso, Texas. Image 37 shows the interior of one of these sanitaria. And they were all the same way. This one's empty, but you can see there were windows that could be opened to allow fresh air in. This was thought to be important in tuberculosis treatment. Generally, the windows faced the sun, so in the northern hemisphere, the windows faced the south, but they were opened year-round, whether it was hot or cold, because it was a combination of fresh air and sunlight and bed rest for many places that were thought to be advantageous in the treatment of tuberculosis. Image 38 shows a sanitarium in New York, and image 39 shows a women's ward. Image 40, another woman's ward. Image 41 shows a men's ward, and it's interesting here, each of the beds were dedicated by a business in the town, and image 42 shows another men's ward. Image 43 shows National Jewish Hospital in Denver, Colorado, a business that's still going. This was the largest sanitarium in the United States, and you can see the women were outside getting the sun and fresh air. Image 44 shows another woman's ward. There were lots of patients with tuberculosis. Image 45 shows a men's ward. Here we have men getting the sun and fresh air in the middle of the winter in northern Michigan. They had on fur coats to stay warm. Image 46 shows children in St. Louis doing exercises in the snow because this particular sanitarium believed that exercise was important in tuberculosis. And there was a big debate at the time, bed rest or exercise, bed rest or exercise. This sanitarium obviously believed in exercise. Image 47 shows part of the outreach that went on in the late 30s and early 1940s. In the United States, you could have a chest radiograph obtained at your home, or right out in front of your home, because a truck would come down the street and you could have a chest x-ray taken. Image 48 shows a man having his image taken within one of these trucks, and image 49 shows the types of films that were gathered, these really small x-rays. And interestingly, when I started my pulmonary fellowship in 1974, they were still offering courses in reading these mini x-rays. Now they're a rarity and hard to find. Image 50 shows the most famous story about a sanitarium ever written. Nobel Prize winner Thomas Mann wrote the book Der Zauberberg, and this is from his gathered works. Now, my favorite image of this is image 50, is image 51, which shows a movie poster from the German film, and it shows the protagonist of this story, Hans Kastorp, the chest x-ray of someone with tuberculosis, and the sanitarium in the background. But for those of you who've read this book, and it's Thomas Mann, so there's no shortage of words. It's a description of what life was like in a tuberculosis sanitarium. It went on day after day after day after day. Patients took their temperature, they went for walks. If they got really sick, they had their x-rays taken. Some of them had surgery. But it's to get an understanding of what it must have been like to be in a tuberculosis patient. I really can't recommend anything better than to read this book. Image 52 shows that sanitarium where Hans Kastorp was in the book The Magic Mountain, as it was probably at the time when he was depicted as being there. Image 53 is another, this is a colored postcard showing the same place in the winter. This is in Davos, Switzerland. And image 54 shows that hotel as it exists now. It's been converted from a tuberculosis sanitarium into a 4-star hotel. It's very fancy, but they retained the x-ray suite. So you can go there and see where the x-rays were taken, and if you've read Der Zauberberg, you can just sit in the same space that Hans Castorp did while he was waiting for his chest x-rays. It's an amazing, amazing feeling. Image 55 shows that we're still having a public health campaign against tuberculosis. This shows World Tuberculosis Day from a site in India where they have young children involved with stopping the tuberculosis epidemic. Image 56, please. So now let's revisit our story. We first picked it up traveling from New York to Boston in 1800 by stagecoach, but now it's 100 years later. We've learned a lot more about tuberculosis. So let's take the train from New York to Boston in 1900. Image 57 shows the interior of a train car, much roomier than a stagecoach, but just your luck, for the 8-hour trip, the man sitting next to you coughs the entire time. Image 58 shows what you might look like 6 months later in this pencil drawing by John Singer Sargent. And after not feeling well for the 4 or 5 months after your train trip, you go to see your doctor. Image 59, you tell your doctor about the train trip to Boston. You're now able to tell your doctor that you had a fever because between 1800 and 1900, the thermometer had been invented and we had clinical thermometry. But otherwise, your symptoms are the same as those of your counterpart from 100 years previously. You had cough and sputum, you were coughing up blood, sweating at night, you were losing weight. When the doctor examines you, he can see loss of muscle mass, just as he could in 1800, but now he has a stethoscope invented by Laennec in 1819 and became part of all medical examinations by the early 1900s, where you can hear Ralls. And we're able to take chest x-rays because of the work of Röntgen, and we can do a sputum culture. So image 60 shows a chest x-ray that might be obtained on such a man. Here it is. You can see the bilateral upper lobe fibroproductive infiltrates. I know you're looking at this image and saying he has it up backwards, but I don't. This image was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, at that time known as the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, in 1910. It's a young man with tuberculosis. But the image was published before we'd established the convention of showing the left side of the patient on the right side of the image. It's not a case of sinus inversus, it's a simple case of tuberculosis. Image 61 shows a sputum smear with tuberculosis using the Ziehl-Neelsen stain. So different from the counterpart in 1800, in 1900, you go from thinking your patient has tuberculosis to knowing that your patient has tuberculosis. This is a big, big medical advance. Image 62. So in the early 1900s, the tuberculosis diagnosis, DX, is based on firm knowledge that we've just reviewed. Public health decreases the spread of tuberculosis, but therapy is left to the image 63 play of chance. Image 64, please. How did we treat tuberculosis in the early 1900s? This is an article from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, the forerunner of the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's about what do you do with patients with tuberculosis. And the author argues that some people think it should be bed rest, some people think it should be exercise, everybody agrees it should be fresh air. But what this man didn't know, and what we know now, is if you have 100 patients with tuberculosis and you do nothing for them, about half of them, assuming they have normal immune systems, will control that tuberculosis, and they will become clinically cured, even though we know they still harbor the bacillus. So if you do nothing, patients get better, and all the elaborate things we were doing was a way of buying time. It was an elaborate nothing. Next image, number 65. It took this man, Burns Amberson, to put things in place. The beginning of understanding how to do clinical trials. Now, Burns Amberson was born in the eastern part of the United States and went to Johns Hopkins Medical School and graduated in 1919. But he graduated with tuberculosis. So instead of going on to do an internship, he went to a tuberculosis sanitarium. Image 66, please. In fact, he went to the Loomis Sanitarium, which is about 150 kilometers northwest of New York City. This is an aerial image of the grounds of the Loomis Sanitarium, and image 67 shows the main building. Now, Burns Amberson spent 9 years at this sanitarium. He married, he had children, he joined the medical staff, and all the time he was a combination patient and caregiver. But in 1926, they decided he was cured. Now, he was cured by a treatment that he was convinced almost killed him. And he wasn't actually even sure if the treatment worked. So here you can imagine he's been discharged from the sanitarium. He spent the 9 years after medical school in a sanitarium. What would he do for work? He had a family to support. He got a job in another sanitarium. Image 68, please. He moved to the Mayberry Sanitarium just outside of Detroit. And he was convinced when he went there that the treatment that he got for his tuberculosis didn't help and probably hurt him, but he wanted to be able to prove that. So image 69 shows the inside of the Mayberry Sanitarium. This is a children's ward. Their philosophy was bed rest. It gets cold in Michigan, but you can see the windows are wide open. There's a lot of light, and the children were at bed rest. This was the treatment for tuberculosis at the time. Image 70 shows the staff at the Mayberry Sanitarium, and third from the left, with the vest and the glasses and his hands in his pocket, not holding the hat, is Burns Amberson. And he had this idea that he was going to study the treatment for tuberculosis that he received as a patient. Image 71 shows the article that he wrote about this. So let's just take a little bit of a look at this. This is an article that was published in 1931 in the American Review of Tuberculosis. It's a clinical trial of sanachrysin in pulmonary tuberculosis. And it turns out that in 1924, 7 years before that, Molgaard published the results of his study of sanachrysin. Now, Molgaard found that sanachrysin killed the tuberculous bacillus in culture, and therefore he was convinced that it could be used for patients. And Burns Amberson probably received this treatment at the Loomis Sanitarium. He was convinced it didn't work. And so he wanted to study it. And the way he studied it was that he put together 2 groups of patients with tuberculosis at the Mayberry Sanitarium. They weren't very big groups. There were 12 patients in each group. And he and his partner, McMahon, matched these patients as precisely as they could. Image 72, please. Here it says, the matching could not be precise, but it was as close as possible, each patient having previously been studied independently by the 2 of us. And then Amberson did something that made him famous forever. Image 73. Instead of deciding that one group was active and one group was placebo on his own, he flipped a coin. He allowed the process of randomization to determine who would receive the active therapy and who would receive the control therapy. And it was that simple maneuver that changed everything, because he let the play of chance decide. previous studies, probably Molgard's study, we don't know for sure, he assembled an active group and a control group, and my guess was the control group was probably sicker and the active group were probably healthier. So after he received their medications, he had the appearance that one group had done better than the other. But here Amberson randomized people, a major step forward. Image 74 shows from this paper how they examined the patients. And like any good clinical trial, even today, they have a manual of procedures. They examined the chest x-ray every other week. They took stereoscopic views. They looked for complications of the treatment. They weighed the sputum. They measured the body weight and temperature. They had very clear ways of determining whether a patient's tuberculosis was better, worse, or the same. Image 75 shows the results from his study. The top half of this image are the patients that were treated with sanacroicin. The bottom half were those that received no treatment. On the left side of the image, you see the categories. Tuberculosis, slightly improved, much improved, unchanged, slightly worse, much worse. In the active treatment group, one patient died during treatment. There were 4 patients that were much worse, 1 that was slightly worse, 5 that were slightly improved. In the control group, there were 6 that were slightly improved, none that were much worse, and nobody died during treatment. And based on this study, he concluded that sanacroicin didn't work. Now, if you look at the top of this, you'll see these were the findings from June of 1927. It took 4 years for the work to be published. But when it was published, it became a classic. This is the American Review of Tuberculosis for that year, shown on image 76, and you can see that's the paper that he wrote. Thousands of students have read this paper, and it became read so much that it fell out of the journal. There's now a high-resolution PDF file in the library, but this was an important step forward. Now, image 77 shows what happened with tuberculosis treatment. Sanacroicin didn't work, and the world was looking for anti-tuberculosis treatments. Antibiotics had been developed in the early 1900s. Penicillin came on the scene in the 1920s, but there were no antibiotics for tuberculosis. Selman Waxman, a professor of microbiology at Rutgers University, was studying fungal extracts, and he found that an extract from the fungus Streptomyces, here in image 77, would inhibit the growth of tuberculosis. And so he used this extract, which he called streptomycin, and found that it inhibited the growth of tuberculosis. But this was a very complicated thing to make, this streptomycin. And so he did something that we really can't do today. He partnered with a drug company. Here we have an academic, Waxman, going to Merck. And Merck made this stuff, streptomycin. And here we see a technician. It took a man a year to make enough streptomycin. We have image 78, please, so that it could be studied. And it was studied in Britain in this article published in the British Medical Journal about the treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis with streptomycin. What these people did that was different from what Burns-Amberson did was that they did a multi-center study. So we've expanded from randomized, but they had randomized multi-center. In the Burns-Amberson study, everybody was enrolled at the same time. In this study, people were enrolled at different times in different places. And so they needed to develop new statistical methods. And if you look at the 4th line from the bottom, among the authors is Professor A. Bradford Hill. And he was the statistician that developed the methods that allowed them to do this study. Image 79 talks about the plan and conduct of the trial, and they found, just like Burns-Amberson, they identified patients that weren't so sick that they were going to die, and they weren't so healthy that they didn't need treatment. They were looking for people in between that had tuberculosis, and they received either streptomycin or the control substance. And this trial was now masked so that the people giving the drug and the people making the assessments didn't know whether people were active or placebo therapy patients. Image 80 shows the control scheme. There's determination of whether a patient would be treated by streptomycin in bed rest, a so-called S case, or by bed rest alone, a C case, was made by reference to a statistical series based on random sampling numbers drawn up for each sex at each center by Professor Bradford Hill. So the art of doing clinical trials is advancing with the statistical art. Now, image 81 shows the results from this study. This shows the outcome stratified by body temperature. The top panel are the low body temperatures, the healthier patients. The bottom panel are the higher body temperatures. And for those of you who don't know, 37 degrees Celsius is the same as 98.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So a fever of 39 or 40 would be the bottom panel. As you can see from the key, if you were above the line, you were improved. If you were below the line, you were worse. A black bar meant that you died. S is streptomycin, C is control. And you can see just by looking here in image 81 that there is an improvement in the streptomycin group compared to the control group. Here were the data. Image 82 shows a chest radiograph, and they had 3 patients like this in the S group, those given streptomycin. The image on the left is onset of therapy in May. The image on the right is 6 months later, and you can see the patient improved. But these investigators were thorough reporters. Image 83 shows a control case that also improved. So they didn't try to hide the fact that some of the controls got better. They didn't know, of course, at the time whether these patients were control or active cases. So image 84 is a very interesting thing. This entire article describing the effectiveness of streptomycin doesn't have a single p-value in it. There's a statement made that Bradford Hill said that the likelihood of this happening by chance alone was less than 1 in 100. Try to publish this now without a single p-value. Image 85 shows that this strategy was used over and over again. We've already reviewed the introduction and the abandonment of gold therapy and the introduction of streptomycin, and it's proof that it worked, and that every one of these drugs that you can see here was introduced for the treatment of tuberculosis. We went into a lull. There wasn't much new until 2012 when TMC 207 came along, which is actually active against many forms of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Image 86 is an engram. So what we did was we went to Google and we said, how often is the term randomized clinical trial in the corpus of digitized literature? That's shown in red. And how does that compare to the term clinical study, shown in blue? Well, you can see for yourself that there were lots of things which were called clinical studies, but it wasn't actually until the late 40s, early 50s, and into the 60s that a lot of clinical studies became randomized clinical trials. This art form really arose in the mid-part of the last century. Image 87. So randomized controlled trials are now the gold standard by where we go from something we think to something we know. Over observational data, which is what we'd been using before that time, they have much better discriminative power. We don't have this problem that we had before where patients get better on their own and we attribute it to the therapy. There have been changes that have been brought to the trials to safeguard the patients in their trial, and we have many, many ways of making sure that the people doing the trials have public accountability. Among them, we have trial registration, ethics boards, so that we can study patients in a way to advance medical knowledge while at the same time keeping them safe. Image 88, please. I want to thank Will Karsbecken and Ming Zai, two Harvard medical students that worked with me on this program, and Celestine Warren, another student that worked with me on the program. Celestine has the distinction of being the great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of John Collins Warren, the first editor of the New England Journal of Medicine.
Slide 89.
Thanks for your attention, and I'll be on the phone to answer questions. Again, I'm sorry I could not be there with you, but this family matter really took precedence. Thank you.